When thinking of traditional quilts, you may think of a 4-patch, a 9-patch, or a simple square. But what if you made a few simple modifications, changing the block sizes and arrangements? You'd be a quilt designer. I call it change-up patchwork. Begin your journey with a traditional 4-patch. Mix up the lineup using 3 different sizes: 4, 8, and 16-inch finished quilt blocks. The various sizes of 4-patch blocks are cleverly combined to create modern, a small to large block theme. Change-up patchwork, that's what's next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, making a difference in sewing, quilting, crafting, and needle arts for over 30 years. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
During this 3-part series on change-up patchwork, this first program is going to be featured on the 4-patch. And you just saw this quilt that has 3 different sizes, 4, 8, and 16-inch blocks. And they're the traditional block sizes, where there are 3 different fabrics in this instance, stitched together and alternated with solid blocks. The creating of the 4-patch is what I'd like to show you now. And these principles will apply throughout all the sewing of this program. We're going to be making stratas, strips of fabric, crosswise strips of fabric that have been cut and sewn together. And there are 2 different stratas, one with the gray and coral, and the other with black and gray. And later I'll be subcutting these into sections, and you can kind of get the idea how that 4-patch is created. But first we need to talk about how to set up the machine to get the best stitching, do this pressing, and then accurate cutting. Because we'll be stitching, subcutting, cutting, stitching, a whole bunch of different configurations, it's good to use a short stitch length. Straight stitch, I have about 2.0 millimeters in length. I put in a new needle, I can't stress that enough, about a size 80 quilting needle, or universal needle is what I like to use. And on the machine I have a patchwork foot that's 1/4 of an inch wide on one side, so I can guide an accurate 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. This next option is optional. It's a seam guide, and I have 2 seam guides the width of the strips apart. Now these strips, to make a 4-inch finished patchwork 4-patch, were cut 2.5 inches. That extra 1/2 of an inch is used for the seam allowance. So I have 2 seam guides on both sides, 2.5 inches apart, and now I have my 2 fabrics. Now normally the strips of fabric would be 40 inches wide, the crosswise strip of the fabric. But for time's sake, I'm just going to sew with a very short stitch length on a shorter strip of fabric, but you'll get the same idea. It may be tempting to lengthen that stitch, but don't. Just make it that 2.0, you'll have a better seam, and when the time is coming to subcut it, you're not going to have frayed seam allowances. Now for pressing. Pressing is as important in quilting and in garment sewing. You got to sew, press, as my mother always told me to do. And when working with this, I always press the seam flat, set the seam, and then press the seam allowances to the dark side. Now I'd like to take 2 steps here. Press to the dark side, kind of catching the tip of the iron right next to that seam and guiding it along, giving it a little steam. But then do a top press. Make certain I don't have a lip. And there's sometimes a lip or a little tuck that you can get if you don't top press. And then, if you would like to set that seam, use a block of wood, a tailor clapper, and just let the moisture of the iron absorb into the wood, and you get a very sharp seam. You're going to create 2 stratas, as I told you earlier, with coral and gray, and another with black and coral, and we're going to cut the subsections at 2.5 inches